On your first interview on the show here, we talked a lot about like what exactly is happening when carbon is being sequestered. Is it's being trapped down there? It's being trapped in different ways. What exactly are we doing when we're sequestering carbon? So I highly recommend everybody go back and listen to that episode as well. So I'll try not to just repeat, although I find that conversation very interesting. But I would like to know, a lot of your work has been done in grasslands. And these, I imagine, are very good for carbon sequestration because we're not kind of tilling up the land and letting, those gases back out. But I do wonder what role the livestock play in that system. Are they just basically the living tractors that are managing these perennials that are really doing the hard work of sequestering carbon? Or is there something else to the science of maybe the microbial interaction between something coming off of the livestock and going into the crop? Like, what exactly is their role? Or are they just, living mowers, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, Tim, this is a great question. It's actually really timely because myself and Francesca and some colleagues, Megan Mockmiller and Chris Wilson, are all writing a manuscript about this right now. But to your question, what exactly are livestock doing to help us sequester carbon when they're grazing? There's a couple of different things that they do, but if you think about it at its most basic level, I mean, what often I think people think of is that livestock are just removing biomass. So how can biomass removal help us do anything to sequester carbon, right? Because you think of sequestering carbon, you want more inputs, more biomass and going into the ground. And cattle are obviously removing some of it to grow their own bodies, respiring some of it in the form of methane, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think of the grass growing on a landscape, really most plants have a really high C to N ratio. So that means there's a lot of carbon per unit nitrogen. And what we know about soil carbon sequestration now is that there are different fractions of soil carbon that behave really differently. They have different lifespans in the soil. They have different ways of getting there. And it turns out that lower C to N ratio input, so these are things like legumes with a lot of nitrogen, or really green grass, for example, fresh new things, manure is low C to N. Those tend to contribute to a fraction of soil carbon called MAOM, mineral associated organic matter. And that's a more persistent, stabilized fraction of soil carbon that tends to stick around for much longer. And so it's not just an inputs-outputs equation in the way that we think about soil carbon formation anymore. And so livestock, in a couple of ways, can contribute. Specifically, what we're measuring is increases in that MAOM, that really stable, not really stable, more persistent, more stable fraction. So by removing biomass, for example, during the grazing process, they're masticating, they're ruminating on some of it, and they're pooping. And that manure tends to be a really high quality soil input, likely more high quality than the plant itself when it's on the surface. So it's kind of transforming plant biomass into something that's easier for microbes in the soil to use and makes them more efficient at forming that pool of stable soil carbon. So that's one way. The other way is in timing of grazing. So, if you imagine a grassland that's growing grass and no grazing happens, no biomass is removed. Eventually, throughout the year, those plants will senesce. So they'll turn brown, they'll seed out. That's when you see the C to N ratio really skyrocket. And it's really hard for that plant material, once it's senesced and kind of woody and tough, to become stable organic matter. It's really hard for microbes to use. It's just like tough cardboard. By removing some of that biomass early on in the grazing season, you can kind of keep plants in the vegetative phase for a little bit longer. And so that maintains their life cycle, and it extends the carbon inputs into the soil at a lower C to N ratio for longer. So that's another way. We are actually attempting to answer the question about the role of microbes with livestock grazing in soil carbon sequestration, soil carbon turnover. that is something that I'm really excited about, but we don't have good answers to yet. I'm actually submitting a grant in a few weeks with Kelly Wrighton, who is a microbial ecologist here at CSU and who has done a lot of like ruminant microbial community work. So hopefully we'll get at some of that. And so I think some of these mechanisms are really clear on how livestock can help increase soil carbon. But then there are still remaining questions about different ways of management and the direct mechanisms by which they're causing these changes. So, grazing can happen in a lot of different ways. Animals can be left in big pastures to kind of graze throughout the year with little to no rotation. And a grazing system like that will have very different impacts than a management system where animals are moved really frequently, potentially where some pasture rest is incorporated. But exactly those mechanisms are still unclear to us. And that's not because we've been unable to answer them, but I think we've just not done a good job at measuring those things. And I have this big kind of stick to wield with the history of grazing soil carbon research and problems in the literature, but we can get into that later if you want.
Oh, okay. Well, no, is that a whole other episode, or is that something you could sum up for us?
It could be both, but let me try to sum it up. I'll try to sum it briefly and concisely. So there's a couple of problems when historically when scientists have tried to measure soil carbon change with grazing management, grazing in general. One is to that spatial heterogeneity point. So if you look back in the literature, often people just aren't collecting enough samples. And so I don't have a ton of faith in some of these papers that are, saying grazing might have no impact. I think that might be true, but we don't know based on some of those papers, based on the number of samples they took. Second is that a lot of historical literature is just looking at grazing versus no grazing, which doesn't really tell us a lot. I think about these nuances that we know exist in grazing. Just the presence of grazing animals tells us nothing, considering that grazing management exists along this huge spectrum. And then lastly, what I see most commonly is a lot of grazing studies will conflate things like grazing intensity with things like stocking rate. So just thinking that the number of animals equates to grazing intensity over the landscape, which we know is not true because it changes with things like, movement and rest and timing and duration. Anyway, so I think the literature is just not very strong.
Okay. So there's so much to dig into there. I do want to go back to the fractions of carbon that's being sequestered. First and foremost, the C to N ratio, does that have to do with what types of microbes are active in those conditions, or does it just have to do with the chemistry of like there's less carbon kind of in that? I'm trying to understand the impact of the C to N ratio on like carbon sequestration.
Yeah. So if you think about all the things that contribute to soil carbon, right? It's above ground biomass, it's root matter, it's things that roots are exchanging with things in the soil, like root exudates. It's microbial necromass, or like microbes once they die and decay in the soil. There's a lot of different things that can enter the soil and contribute to soil carbon. Some of those things have a lot of nitrogen. For example, microbes have a really low C to N ratio. There are different types of plants. So legumes, for example, things like alfalfa or clover that have natural nitrogen fixing capabilities. So that will, lower their C to N ratio. That's really important because microbes are most efficient. So microbial necromass, kind of dead microbes, are one of the main contributors to that stable soil organic carbon fraction. But in order for microbes to be able to use a substrate to grow their bodies, to grow their communities, to build in microbial biomass, they need nitrogen. And so they'll kind of eat away at the carbon in things until they get to the nitrogen. And the more carbon there is per unit nitrogen, the lower the carbon use efficiency in those microbes are, and the more of that carbon is actually respired instead of sequestered. And so that's just one aspect of soil carbon sequestration. But generally speaking, higher C to N ratio soil inputs lead to more of that carbon being respired than sequestered, than is the case in lower C to N ratio things.